So yeah, the discussion, I suppose, introduction today is around IP management. Just to do that, show some introductory slides to what we do at IP Active, and then talk about managing IP across new technologies, the nature of IP rights, and the factors to consider, which is more important, I suppose, in managing IP, and then discussions and opportunities. So IP Active is an innovation management company. The group that we work with, there's a group of 5 of us at the moment. Our business got hit by COVID-19, so we're managing that crisis. But we all come from an experience, our team comes from an experience of research and development and technology management. We're a tech-based company focused on IP and commercialization. All our employees have got various postgraduate degrees in whether that's in biotechnology or engineering or otherwise. So we're a tech-focused company. We focused on those 4 core areas: research and development management, IP protection and commercial strategies, and then commercial partner engagement are the 4 core areas we do for clients. In terms of IP management, these are the 4 core brackets, I suppose, which we help an organisation, big or small, in managing their IP. So at the moment, in the context of a startup, we're basically at this end, which is the technology IP, is really identifying the IP that you have. And in particular, who contributed to that IP? Do you actually have the rights to that IP based on the contributions? That can be your friends, can be your colleagues, can be your work colleagues, can be subcontractors. We'll touch on that. But that's, I suppose, very important, and that's where this chain, if you like, starts. And then once you've identified that IP, identify those IP risks that are attached with your technology or your outcome, how you're managing and reporting that and recording that IP as it's developed. That can be very important, particularly if there are some disputes around who actually invented the IP or who owns the IP. And then obviously from a technology point of view, there's also commercial risks to consider. Are you developing a technology that really someone else has protected already? And that protection can be a technology. We do a lot of trademark searching for clients. Commercial risks from a trademark point of view is that there's already existing the same or similar trademarks in the marketplace. So that can be important if you're thinking about a name for your startup or name for your business or name for your product, is how you're going to protect that name, and actually can you use the name that you've selected. So then we progress into the project IP, commercial IP and corporate IP. So if you're starting off as a small business and hopefully it grows into a corporate IP, there's different levels of IP management which we won't go through now, but they're all the areas of what we cover off in working with our clients. These are some of our clients. As I said in the introduction, I've come from a agricultural technology background. That background comes from everything from biotechnology and genetically modified organisms through to nanotechnology, through to agricultural equipment. And we interact with quite an expansive group of research organisations through those clients, whether that's CSIRO, universities, and quite a large group of commercial companies. In a commercial context, the key is commercial focus. So everyone, whether you're a startup or just having a business idea, you really need to think about that commercial context. And I'm sure, as Joyce said in the introduction, you need to keep that right focused in the forefront of your mind, the customer and the value proposition, etc. So it's important to keep this commercial focus, who you think your partners are, and in the terms of an IP perspective, how your IP will fit to that customer. So if your customer is a large organisation in the sense of a partner, you need to understand how your IP will be used or valued by that customer. In this context, we do a lot of work where the customer is the commercial client, is your partner, not just the end user. So you need to understand what that commercial company will do with your technology if they become a partner, and how they will use it, and how it creates value for them, not just the end user. So we do a lot of work in that space. So that's the introduction. Joy, if we start on some IP elements.
We might just get an intro from our other mentors first, Alice, and then we'll come back around to that as well. But thank you, that's great, and hopefully that's given everyone a bit more insight into where that IP conversation can go. Anthony, we'll get an intro from yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Joy. Yeah, as I said earlier, I'm employed by Osmine. Osmine's an industry body, the main industry body for the METS sector nationally, been around for 30 years, about 550 members, and the focus of Osmine is to essentially to grow the METS sector in Australia. So build that METS brand domestically and overseas, do a lot of trade missions to various countries with Australian METS companies. So do a lot of activity around driving innovation in the sector, and we provide a conduit between METS companies and their customers, which are typically major mining houses. My position as a business facilitator is fully funded by the federal government's entrepreneurs program, so Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources. I work nationally as in a business facilitation role, and essentially what that means is developing projects around a single major buyer and endeavouring to create more strategic connections with their small to medium-sized suppliers. So a big part of my job is getting into the head of the buyer, understanding what they need and what they require from their suppliers, and then working with the suppliers to build capability in line with that major buyer requirement. Usually those projects center around a single buyer. One that's sort of tailing off now is Fortescue FMG in Western Australia in their rotables category. Current project, which doesn't involve a central buyer, is a project around Mine Expo, the largest mining exhibition in the world, or one of the largest. In some doubt as to whether it will go ahead in September this year at the moment, but essentially that project is around helping 16 METS companies do what they can to build capability to generate commercial outcomes from that exhibition. A number of those companies are doing new product launches. So we're looking at all of the capability required for them to be successful in some of those offshore markets. The Entrepreneurs Program has 3 pillars. So business management is where I work. Innovation Connections provides linkages with industry and research institutions, and accelerating commercialization. I think you met Stuart Hazel 1 or 2 sessions ago. That's where he had come from. And then just finally, the side gig that I do is Australian government has asked me to be industry liaison officer to the European Southern Observatory, which is a 60-year-old optical astronomy organisation based in Germany. They have large telescope facilities in the Atacama Desert in Chile, and part of the 10-year arrangement that the Australian government signed is that occasionally there's opportunities for Australian industry. So my job is to match opportunity with industry capability. We're also doing a project called Fit for Big Science, which drills down into the capabilities that Australian SMEs should be focusing on if they want to be competitive in this science sector space, whether it be radio or optical astronomy, space, nuclear, and a range. So some interesting engagements with industry around that aspect. That's it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks for that, Anthony. And yes, I like astronomy. So every time you say that, it's like, oh, I want to learn more about that. But yeah, a wide scope of what you have there. And I'm sure that all of our participants will get some great value from having a conversation with you and hearing from you as well. So thank you for that. And Ben, you've joined us. So I can see you there. So welcome, Ben. We'll get you to do a little intro of who you are and where you're from and what you do.
Sure, Joy. Hi. You can hear me all right? I've got my headphones on to try and drown out a bit of the background noise. One of those people or parents working from home with the kids in the background at the moment. So sorry if there's a bit of screaming for everybody. Yeah, Joy, nice to see you again and nice to connect with everybody. For my part, slightly different. I'm actually a corporate advisory partner at McCullough Robertson Lawyers. So for those who haven't come across McCullough Robertson, we're a law firm, large sort of national law firm, headquartered actually out of Brisbane. But have offices up and down the East Coast. For my part, I tend to work with a number of companies, both in the early stages all the way through to sort of growth clients and those that might look ultimately for a listing or a trade sale. So part of the appeal for me with McCullough's has always been that idea that we can work. We're a firm that's been around for 93 years, worked with a large number of companies that have been in the early stages and notionally been startups, and sort of grown with them and had that sort of success with them and sort of 10, 20-year relationships with a number of our clients. I do, so I think we'll be touching a bit this morning on IP and IP considerations. I'm not actually an IP lawyer, although I do sit with our commercial and IP team and deal with IP and IP considerations regularly in the sense of companies particularly looking to do a capital raising or companies that are looking at some other form of corporate transaction whereby you're having to do some due diligence on their IP, or even in sort of the early days with companies looking to commercialize their IP, how best to go about that. Are we looking at developing the IP for that particular company, sort of being assigned in and then developed out and growing from there, or are you looking at some form of license or licensing arrangement? And we do the full sort of gambit of that work with companies. And I've had a chance to connect with Joy and David on a few occasions and drop into Toowoomba. In terms of things close to home, I mentioned do the sort of full spectrum of capital raising work. One of the things that we were excited to do was the Wagner family IPO back in 2017 now. But we do tend to do a lot of the listings for various companies and Queensland-based companies. So happy to chat about all of that today with people in the mentoring sessions, but appreciating that probably we're going to focus more on the IP sort of side of things this morning.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Ben. And yeah, really grateful that you can be with us again, and nice to see you looking fairly relaxed there at home if you've got kids.
In the morning, after a long weekend, that's right.
That's good. Wonderful. I'm actually going to start with you with a question. So prior to you jumping on, I ran through a few points, and one of them was around the fact that when we're creating a business, it's good to have a bit of a thought process around what the end is going to look like. And you just mentioned, Wagner's with their IPO, but trade sales, like, if you're, what do you want your business to become for you at the end of the day? It's an asset and you want to be able to sell it. So when you see businesses at that stage, I guess, and I'm putting you on the spot because we haven't pre-positioned what these questions are.
No, that's fine.
But are there key issues that arise that you see people haven't prepared for at the time that they're wanting to sell their business? What are some of those things that people are neglecting to act upon throughout the development of their business that become an issue for them at the time they want to sell?
Sure. There's a few things we can touch on there. I mean, one of the things in the context of IP is often if we are looking at a sale of a business, you would do an IP due diligence and IP, often chain of title. I didn't mention industries that we work across, but tend to work across a spectrum of industries. For my part, I do a lot in technology and biotech, but do and historically have worked with a number of resources and renewable companies as well. But taking technology and biotechnology companies as the best example, it does come up that you do an IP chain of title, And invariably, even with companies in the mature stages where sometimes the company or the pace of the growth of the company has sort of outrun or outgrown some of the administrative side of things, you may find that you have certain gaps. So it can be gaps in contracts, can be gaps in employment arrangements, all kinds of things when we do a due diligence on a company at the tail end. But one of those things is IP. So, and have had situations, or aware of partners in the firm who have had situations going for an IPO or a trade sale, but they've actually identified they're missing a major part of their IP was either never assigned to the organization or the company, or the license terms for to the extent your IP is covered by a third-party license, it's perhaps doesn't actually meet up to the expectations that you thought you had. So for an investor coming in or for a buyer of that business, they pour through those sort of things, and the minute they identify some sort of gap in ownership, say, of IP, it can create a big issue. And so in an IPO I was aware of, they did actually identify there was a particular bit of technology that had never come across and never been assigned, and they had to go back to this individual who realized that the company was going for a listing, and at that point in time realized they had quite a bit of leverage before they, and I think probably behaved relatively well in the grand scheme of things, but did ultimately get a pretty significant payment for the assignment of that IP at that point in time, because there was this sort of gap and they had identified that there was an opportunity, or they had leverage over the company at that point. So I think the message is sort of, to the extent you can, getting your house in order. And we often talk, even in the early days of thinking about structure, are you going to use a company as opposed to using some sort of trust structure or an unincorporated, like a partnership or a sole trader type arrangement? Often having that company structure is appropriate. Makes it typically easier to sell as well, because you sell the shares in the company as opposed to perhaps selling a business or the assets. But setting up all of those contracts in the right way as best you can early on, while you're developing out the business, developing out your piece of technology, your prototype, your idea, so that as much as possible, everything's in order at the point in time that you're getting into that due diligence, which can happen sooner than you think. And the quick way to put somebody off, actually, if they're looking at buying the business or looking at investing, is if you don't have some of those documents collated in, say, a file, a folder, a data room, and you can't readily provide those, that can immediately raise a red flag for people. So sort of getting a lot of that material in order early on, I think, is the takeaway.
Wonderful. Thanks, Ben. That's great. And I think, yeah, it's certainly something that if we can be thinking about it in the early stages and setting up our house as such, and getting that house in order throughout, it's much better than, the sleepless nights you have prior to a meeting with somebody for the first time, trying to find all the bits and pieces and inevitably missing something. So Dallas, we might jump to you then, just to cover a bit more around IP and what that is. And I'll hand it over to you to do a little run through of a bit more detail on that.
Thanks, Joy. Just to share screen again. Prepared a few slides. So present that. So you can see that now. I thought I'd just run up some ideas around IP considerations when you're developing your team. The first point of view there is to identify the value of the IP. Every organisation, whether small or big, develops potentially lots of IP. You hear so many people, I've interviewed so many organisations, we don't have much IP because they don't really understand the context of what they're developing. So it's important to really articulate the IP elements that you're developing and where those true high value IP items are. You can spend a lot of money and arguing over IP, but you really need to identify, what is the crucial elements of your IP. So the other key point, sorry, just go back. IP rights. The other important thing, I think, which is what Ben articulated, is are they yours, that chain of title, and do you actually have the right to exploit I've been in many situations, as Ben alluded to, similar situations where an organisation wants to commercialise their IP, and they really, when you do a deep dive, they really don't have the rights to exploit that IP, whether that's via contract or whether they actually don't own the IP. So that's very important, even if you're a startup and you're using, and you've got employees, you know, has your employment contract covered off on the IP that employee will develop for you? If you're using a subcontractor, do you actually have a subcontract agreement that assigns the IP that they develop across to you? Understanding what your subcontractor is developing and that IP, are they actually, one of the tricky points is know-how. Are your subcontractors developing particular know-how that you will have to potentially license as part of the IP license agreement? And how are you managing that IP in those contracts? That's an often difficult one, but it's an important one to consider in your contracts with particularly subcontractors. The key message for startup is, if you pay for something, the initial premise is, if I pay for something, I own it. From an IP land point of view, that analogy and that rule of thumb does not exist, particularly around algorithms and copyright. Copyright must be assigned by written contract. It can't be verbal, it can't be otherwise, it must be by a written contract. So if you're developing software tools, etc., it's important to have written contracts with your subcontractors. So that's important. That's all about managing your IP and product development. The key message too is business planning and commercial strategy. So a lot of people want to jump down IP protection and say, we've got this IP, but you need to think about that in the context of your business going forward and your commercial strategy. Is IP protection critical to your business strategy? So for copyright and circuit layouts, which I'll touch on in a minute, that protection is guaranteed once it's developed. It doesn't have to be registered. There's no formal registration in Australia for a copyright or for trade circuits. But for other forms of IP, you may have to register that IP. And potentially that could be an expensive activity, particularly if you're looking at international protection. You could spend tens of thousands of dollars fairly quickly. So you don't want to jump that path early, particularly as a startup. You can't afford to spend money on IP protection if you've got to spend money on your product development. So you need to develop strategies around protecting your IP through contracts, through confidentiality agreements, or through keeping your IP secret, if you like, as long as you can. So that's really important, I think, for a startup is think about what's more important for you. Is IP protection critical to your business going forward? Just really quickly on the forms of IP, very basic. Copyright is the form of protection of IP. It doesn't protect. The key message here, for those that don't know anything about IP, is a lot of people perceive, I came up with the idea of the algorithm. I came up with the idea of that data analysis. Copyright will protect the software, potentially protect your algorithms, etc. But it won't protect the idea behind those algorithms. So that concept of data analytics, etc., if you're in that space, is not protected by copyright in the context of how, or the idea behind that data analysis. That is covered by the next context, which is patents, particularly if it's a new and innovative idea. You can protect that by patents. Patents covers everything from in mechanical devices right through to biological technologies, and potentially the way the data is analysed can be protected by patents. So it's a very broad space. And so you need to think about the context of going down a patent path if you really want to protect your basic idea or the process by which your invention works. The other and most critical form of IP protection is your trademarks. Going forward, as we touched on the introduction, trademarks protect the word, logo, shape, noise, smell, lots of different things. But it's around protecting those goods and your reputation behind those goods is the trademarks. Designs protect the appearance of, or the function, not the function, sorry, the appearance of a product. So design protection can be important, particularly if it's a particular component that may have value. We've worked with engineering companies around design protection for small components that are fitted to larger agricultural equipment, and just protecting that small piece as a design helps protect their business. Circuit layouts, circuit layouts protect the original layout of an integrated circuit and chip. So if you're into electronics, etc., you may want to protect your circuit layouts. And the last one there is trade secrets, protecting confidential information and know-how going forward. Trade secrets can be critical to protecting your business going forward. So they're the core elements of plant breeders' rights. I assume none of you are developing plant breeders' rights, but they're the core elements of IP protection which you need to consider. Just the last slide in terms of strategy, and this is really important when you're going forward with commercial partners. Again, as Ben sort of articulated, is your IP strategy and your strength of your protection, irrespective of what it is, whether it's copyright or patents or otherwise. It's really a commercial partner or an investor, whether they're venture capitalists or otherwise, they want to know the encumbrances that you have around your IP. So that's where you need to do the due diligence. Have you actually got commercial freedom to operate in a space? And it can get very embarrassing if they're investing and then later on you find out that you actually haven't got commercial freedom to operate. So you need to do your due diligence there. The two key elements around freedom to operate or commercial freedom to operate is the background IP that came into your technology or your new IP. And again, that could include know-how from a third party that you're using, and managing that IP coming forward into your IP. So understanding your IP ownership. It's not just about IP ownership, but also, do you actually have the right to exploit your IP? That's the crucial thing. So you can own something, but you still may not have the right to exploit or to license because you have a subcontract or because you've used a particular background IP that you haven't got commercial rights to. A clear example of that in the software sector is if you're using third-party software and you make improvements on that, but you actually haven't got the rights to commercialize or that background software technology, then you can't go forward without the commercial rights to the provider of that background IP. So going forward in terms of value, the key thing is commercial landscape for your IP and the scope of protection. The broader your scope of protection, the higher the value is. And where does that sit on a commercial landscape from an IP point of view? So Joy, they're the key elements, I suppose, from IP perspective that I'd like to portray as a general sense.
Wonderful, thanks for that, Dallas. So hopefully that gives everyone a little bit more perspective around what that conversation needs to encompass if you're not yet having it, or maybe you've started to have that conversation, but it might need to go further. And particularly, as we said before, you know, if you can get the groundwork right from the beginning, you know, get your contracts right and things like that, that a lot of it is, you know, fairly systematized and it's going to put it in place for you quite neatly. It'll save you a lot of headache in the future, having to go back and rewind and try and, you know, navigate the path of where it even created and who owns it and having it reassigned. And as Ben said, you know, if you find that there's a critical piece missing, or, you know, a portion missing that isn't, you know, controlled by yourself, and you need to then pay someone for it, it's probably a lot cheaper to pay them when they're creating it and you haven't grown anything yet. Then, of course, if you've gone on, you know, several years and grown a business and you're being acquired, or, you know, at that stage where the person having to relinquish their ownership of that asset now sees a lot more value in it than they did perhaps the day they created it. So we want to be, yeah, helping you on that journey. So another thing that I'm conscious of, and I guess this could be something, Anthony, that might probably fall more into your space, is where you see different organisations starting to work together and, you know, working out, and not necessarily going into the IP part of it particularly, but having those negotiations around how different organisations are going to come together, how they're going to work. I'm keen to know your thoughts and what you've seen, and particularly with the work that you're doing. You know, even the Mine Expo sort of come to mind, where you've got lots of different organisations coming together for that event, obviously, but more in a business sense, doing business together. Where you see, I guess, main challenges that appear in people starting to collaborate and work together and, you know, come up with an agreement that is a win-win for both sides. So again, that's probably a long question. I need to get better at shortening my questions. But Anthony, what you see happening, particularly in those, you know, collaboration opportunities, and any challenges that you think people might be needing to be aware of?
Yeah, thanks, Joy. Look, collaboration is something probably over the last 12 months that I've really picked apart with regard to SMEs. So, you know, I operated, you know, I had a role with state government during the construction phase of the coal seam gas sector in southwest Queensland, and the major proponents would roll through town and they'd talk about their opportunities, and they'd say, well, for the smaller companies, you know, you should collaborate with other companies and combine your product service offer, and then off they'd go. And the companies that would think, yeah, that may sound like a good idea, but not really know where to start. So I get a bit tired of the word collaboration because it gets used a lot, but it very infrequently occurs effectively. So in the science stuff that I do, I travel to Europe. I talk to my counterparts over there, and you know, I think European companies collaborate with each other far better and more frequently than what Australian companies do. And that's partly because of the environment, but there's also some other factors there as well. I actually think this is really an interesting challenge for Australian companies, I think, because sometimes I think our Australian culture, on face value, we're very welcoming and quite warm, but when it comes to business, we're often very siloed, and we like to keep to ourselves. And part of that, I think, is tall poppy syndrome. You know, we're physically isolated from each other. You know, that can play a role, but it's not something that comes naturally to Australian SMEs typically. I think there's tremendous opportunity there. So one of the projects I'm doing, which was that Fit for Big Science project, we broke it down and we looked at the components. We actually analysed companies. We do a diagnostic to see how likely they are or how ready they are to collaborate. And we look at things like their risk profile, how risky they look to others. We look at the soft skills, their ability to build trust and rapport. We look at things like their IP strategy. You know, often they don't have an IP strategy in place. They have concerns about sharing their intellectual property. But if they've mapped that out and they're confident what they're comfortable to share or not share, then that certainly helps going into a possible relationship. Look at governance, their understanding of the commercial vehicles that sit around or can sit around collaboration, their project management capability. All of these things, when you break that motherhood statement of collaboration down, become things that a business can actually start to work on and improve. With regards to a smaller company collaborating with a much larger company, let's say a company that's got an SME that's got innovation, they're wanting to partner in some form with a large mining house, for example. To me, and you've done a great job in previous sessions, I've listened to the recordings, talking about pain and gain and understanding that. And I think, you know, that negotiation scenario where the smaller company is sitting down at the table with the much larger company, a couple of quick things I'd put in there is being very, very aware of the journey, and you used that word before, I think it's very relevant, Joy, the journey that's got you to the table. Because if you weren't on the radar of that much larger company, you've been evaluated every step of the way, whether you realize it or not. And when they're sitting down, they're delving into the positive, into the negative aspects of how they've seen your business over that journey. So if I'm talking to a company that's engaging with a larger company for the first time, I'll talk to them about mapping their moments of truth and making sure every contact point blows them away if possible, but at least a positive moment of truth. Because when you sit down at the negotiation table, you would hope that they're going to think about all the positive aspects and the positive contact they've had over what's led to that negotiation. But almost invariably, they're going to look at, okay, what did this company not do well? Where did this company slip up? And what I'm talking about here is not necessarily focusing on the technical interactions that you've had with that larger company, but also the non-technical stuff. You know, how you've represented yourself from an administration point of view, how well you've managed the relationship. You know, that they've seen that you've been managing risk in your business and that you take active interest in assessing risk in their business. All of those things might not be attached to the bells and whistles of the innovation that you're offering them and the core of what you're negotiating, but they're really critically important to the overall negotiation. That's a long-winded response to a long question, Joy. There you go.
No, I think that's great. And I think there's some really good points in there. And I love the fact that you do pick up on the fact that it is, you know, it's that journey. And I think for some organisations, it's even documenting that journey. You know, things happen day to day and you kind of go, oh, it happened. And, you know, maybe it wasn't a good experience, but I'll move on from that. But sometimes the actual process of documenting that, whether it's writing, you know, a blog article that you're going to publish to the world, or whether it's just journaling it yourself or something like that, can also help you reflect internally on how you handled that situation and how you might handle it differently next time as well. But it also gives you something to go back and reflect on when you are preparing to have a conversation and think, okay, if other people have seen this happen and they're going to maybe raise these points of something that I did or my organisation did in the past that, you know, maybe we didn't handle it particularly well at the time, but have we learned from that? Have we grown? So that if they raise that as a potential area of concern that they have, you've got, you know, some awareness at least of being able to respond to that question or, you know, be part of that conversation. Because I think, you know, so much of the, you know, collaboration or whatever we choose to call it is around the, you know, connecting with people that we feel are good for us to be with. You know, that we want to do business with, that we want to, you know, engage with, we want to help their business, we want to help our business together, and it has to feel good as well. So making sure that we're ready to be part of that relationship and comfortable with the conversations that will come is really important. So yeah, some great points. Thanks, Anthony.
I'll just add in there, so nobody expects your business to be perfect, but what they are hoping for is that you've got you're aware, as you said, Joy, you're spot on, and a culture of continuous improvement that you're building on experience. Yeah,
definitely. Awesome. Thank you for that. So we've got about 10 minutes left now before we're going to jump into our breakout rooms. And Ben, I'm going to jump back to you. And sorry, I didn't actually see exactly when you dropped in, but I covered a little bit towards the end of just the introduction around you know, capital raising and preparing for that and what that means. And I know, you know, you've been part of that both with obviously McCulloch Robertson, but also some work with, you know, things like the Business Development Fund,
yes,
looking to help people there. I just wondered maybe, can you just give a little introduction to what the BDF is, but also for anyone who might be looking at seeking investment, apart from IP, which we know is super important, but just you know, again, probably a housekeeping of your organisation, particularly financially. What else people might need to be really thinking about at this stage of their journey to be prepared for raising, whether it's, you know, $25,000 from grandma or whether it's, you know, $2.5 million from someone else. What should you have in order and thinking about, and a little bit about the BDF?
Sure, Julia, no, very off mute, I think. Yep, very happy to talk a bit more about that. And I think we probably won't talk about it today, but there are other programs out there that can support companies in the early days, which doesn't necessarily involve equity capital raising. So like the Ignite Ideas grants and things like that, which I know a few of the companies I think I'd seen had been thinking about that or potentially applied for it. So in the context of capital raising, I did see, I was there at the tail end of your slides. I like the sort of gold pot with the rainbow, actually. I think that was good job. I'll borrow that one. And had a good snapshot of the various forms of raising that you can have. So it's sort of partly thinking about how you want to go out there to actually raise the funds in terms of what form. Are you looking for debt? Are you looking to issue shares in your company? Let's use a company for simplicity's sake. Coming back to your value as a company, so having a think, maybe engaging with a financial advisor or an accountant to give you an indication of what the value of your company may be. So we haven't got enough time today, but sort of thinking about if you're dividing up your equity, how much is that going to represent? So are you giving up sort of 10% of the company or 15%, 20%, whatever it may be? And so, sorry, when I say equity raising, that's that idea of issuing shares in a company in return for funds. So that's equity capital raising. And then even thinking a bit about your investment documentation that you have in place. So for example, do you already have, if there's co-founders, do you have a shareholders agreement at the moment that governs some of the rights that exist between you in terms of, you know, things that are common are there, like if one of you is to transfer your shares, that the other might have a first right of refusal or preemptive rights to take them up. Looking at things like drag and tag rights. So a drag right is the ability to sell, and if you're hitting a certain threshold, say 75%, you can force other people to, force sounds a bit harsh, but that is really how it operates. So you can force everybody to go along with you as part of that sale process. So looking at those rights that you have or an agreement you have, and thinking about how might that document need to change if you introduce a new person in to the organization and a new person as an investor, at the same time as not necessarily jumping the gun of you can't to the crystal ball gaze exactly what an investment's going to look like, and remembering that some of these investors will have their own form, their own investment terms, or their own form of documentation that they like to use for the purpose of their investment, which I guess neatly fits into the BDF, so the Queensland BDF Business Development Fund. They, for example, have their own form of documentation. So we're talking about IP, their IP assignment deed, I'm pretty sure they have up there. They might even have an employment agreement, actually, not necessarily advocating you use it, because of course you've got to sort of make sure it's fit for your company and fit for purpose. They'll have their own form of shareholders agreement, subscription agreement, and all that sort of stuff. So maybe they want you to use those sort of terms. So if you want to have a look at a shareholders agreement, you can go on the Business Development Fund's website and download one and have a flick through and have a read. In terms of the BDF and who they are, they've operated now for probably 4 years, part of the Advanced Queensland program, and it's managed by QIC, Investment Corporation, the Queensland Investment Corporation, who we actually happen to share a building with. And so we've been on the panel for QIC to actually assist them with the investments that have been deployed, or the funds that have been deployed by the Business Development Fund, actually have always been conflicted out because we've already been acting for the companies that have been seeking the investment. So I've actually worked on about 8 or 10 of those investments for various different companies now. Where it's fantastic is it's a match fund effectively. So if you're able to raise funds from investors out in the market, and it doesn't necessarily encompass family members or closely related parties, but if you can have external investors that are coming in, say for $100,000, the proposition is that the BDF would match those funds. And so they would come in as a co-investor with that investor. So immediately you're doubling up your capital raising, which is great. And it's got some terms that go with it. So they've got things like put and call options. So they've got an ability to exit at a point in time in the future by effectively putting their shares on other people, but relatively preferential terms. So they're not looking for really the same sort of financial return as other investors out there in the market. They're looking to support companies by matching funds, accelerating growth for those companies, and then exiting at a point in time in the future. So a really good thing to sort of think of if your company's set up in the right way and you're sort of looking at equity capital raising, have a think about the PDF, and I can talk to a few of you a bit more about that if you like. The other thing I'd say, Joy, is your business. You've talked, I'm sure, already about pitch practice and your business case and your elevator pitch. So thinking about that as well, in terms of if you're going to have that investment conversation, you're sort of stepping it up a notch in terms of it's great to pitch your idea to colleagues and friends and to each other as a cohort. The minute you talk to an investor, it's slightly different, but sort of thinking how you pitch your business, not in terms of, so often the key thing is not what your product or particular service does, or that sort of customer facing pitch. It's actually what's the financial proposition to an investor, and what is your business? What is the growth trajectory? What's the market look like? How do you see the value of the business increasing over time? So you have to kind of switch your mindset a bit in relation to what that conversation is going to be like. The other thing is, and particularly at the moment with the virus and people not necessarily deploying funds in the same way, don't think that means you can't talk to some of these investors. So having that sort of warm discussion or keeping in touch with potential supporters or advocates for your business. Often, angel investors and VCs will say, I'm not going to invest anything in your company until I've seen you or spoken to you 5 times. That's just a rule of thumb. So keep those touch points and connections with those individuals. Don't necessarily think the first time I meet them, like a Shark Tank, I'm immediately going to secure the funding. That's actually not really how it tends to work in practice. Can sometimes work that way, but not generally. And so keeping those touch points. The only other thing I think, Joyce, there's that concept of being investor ready, and we've talked about making sure you've got your company and your records together if someone is doing a bit of due diligence before they invest. But thinking, about how you sort of pitch your business case. So maybe having a slide deck, or having, sometimes they call an information memorandum, which is a sort of short form document, a written document that you can give to people about what you're doing and what the business proposition is. And even the only other thing I'd say is, even if you're currently organising, you're currently moving forward just with investment from friends and family, it's still very important to think about having a shareholders agreement and just sort of making sure that you are having a commercial conversation with those people and a commercial relationship with those people, which can be more difficult when it's your family members, but still going about it in that way. So there's a lot of things we could talk about, and usually it takes sort of an hour to go through a lot of that stuff, Joy. So it's a bit of a snapshot, but we're definitely happy to talk to people about that a bit more in the mentoring session.
Wonderful. Thanks, Ben. That's great. And I think, there's so many different elements that we need to consider. So it's thinking, like hearing what Ben's saying and going, oh, have I thought about that yet? Do I need to think about that yet? Am I at this point? What do I need to be doing? So being aware of a lot of these things is good, but then starting to put them into place as the situation arises, if it hasn't yet already, is important. And just on the pitching, so we haven't got into pitching yet, which normally we would, but because the sessions are much shorter each week, we haven't. But next week we will be talking a bit more around pitching and preparing for that, and preparing for demo day as well. So you'll be in part of that conversation next week. So I think we've had Ian join us as well. So Ian, I might just give you the floor for a couple of minutes if you want to take yourself off mute there, and just tell us a little bit about METS Ignited from your side, because we've got a couple of people on the call who perhaps haven't heard. Obviously we've done our introduction in the beginning, but from you. So if you want to introduce yourself and what you're doing with METS, that would be great.
Okay, thanks, Joy. I'll be brief. METS Ignited is one of the growth centres that's been set up by the federal government to basically improve the international competitiveness of a number of Australia's sectors, and in particular those sectors where we believe that we can do better internationally. And a big part of that is around collaboration. It was good to hear Anthony talked before about the issues around collaboration in the sector. And METS Ignited, we tend to concentrate on getting the ecosystem, getting all the stakeholders in the METS and mining innovation area to try and work together better. And one of the things that we have been focusing on for the last couple of years as a pilot is in clustering. It was also great to hear a bit about the IP issues and around collaboration, because when we talk about clustering, we realise that we are significantly behind the Europeans in this, and they have a number of resource industry clusters operating, and there's some now starting in the last couple of years in North America. They will be competing in Australia. In fact, some of those clusters are already competing in Australia. And what they do is that they make it more attractive for the mining companies, resource companies, to deal with the clusters, because rather than just having one particular METS company pitching a particular point solution to a mining operation, these clusters come together and tend to offer suites of products and services. And those suites of products and services are of larger total value, and those larger total value then is something that's attractive to the mining companies, because they don't have to actually manage individually so many suppliers. So I just wanted to reinforce that, because it's a really important issue in Australia going forward, not only with the domestic market, but also in the way that we work as collaborators to get or to open up new markets in the global sense too. Apart from that, METS Ignited is piloting a number of accelerators, and this one here, as you'd be aware, is one of the Queensland regional accelerators. Our long-term aim is to have this particular type of accelerator operating around Australia, from regions all throughout Australia. We are not defining the actual processes or the methods of acceleration, because we know, and this is from the work of Chad Renando, we know that all of the regional and remote areas in Australia tend to have some innovation spaces, and they're doing things now. So we just want to actually give that a theme, if you like, of METS and mining. What we will be doing though, and we're just about to announce it, we'll be running an accelerator, a scale-up accelerator, which last year we ran it between Brisbane and Perth. This year, I'm not sure yet if Perth's going to be involved, but whatever we're doing, it'll be fully online, and with the objective of in a couple of years' time of having this then come together as a genuinely national accelerator, but taking the best and the brightest from all of the regional accelerators. So I'll leave it at that. Visit the METS Ignited website if you want to see what's going on. As I said, primarily we're working not with individual firms, but we work with the stakeholders, the industry organisations such as AustMine, the regional organisations. We work with the Minerals Council and so on. And our role is to try and get everybody to work together better, for the benefit of the Australian METS internationally and for the benefit of the economy overall. Thanks, Joy.
Awesome. Thanks, Ian, and thanks for dropping in again today. We appreciate your time. Now, we are going to jump into the breakout room, so